Thank you, Melissa, for inviting me along for this. And I just wanted to start by saying, you know, you heard Chrissy's biography from me, and I may not sound like the most natural person to be speaking to this book, but I do love bushwalking, and it's something that I did a lot in my former home in Canada. And I think that's where I actually wanted to start. And I'll just hold up the book and say, unabashedly, this is a brilliant book that you should buy. It is absolutely a treat to read. It speaks a lot to, I think, Australian identity. And as a Canadian and someone who always said hiking when I went into the woods, I just wanted to start by thinking about that a little bit, actually, because, you know, when I first moved to Australia 10 years ago, bushwalking was a new word to me. And so it was really riveting to read about the genesis of this term and how it came to be an activity in Australia. And I think I just wanted to throw that out to you, Melissa, as a starting point for discussion. You know, bushwalking, what makes it uniquely Australian? And, you know, how is bushwalking different from hiking, for example?
Thanks, Andrea, and for that lovely introduction. And thanks to those of you who have joined us today. Yeah, I mean, the term is an Australian word, so we can claim it as our own invention. You know, as you suggest, there's all sorts of different words that are there to talk about walking in nature. So rambling in the UK, tramping in New Zealand, hiking in North America. And those words were used in Australia when people were walking, along with others like tracking, trekking, you know, trailing. We use tramping a little bit here, or sauntering, loping, meandering. So there's all kinds of words that were used to kind of describe walking. And yeah, it's interesting that perspective that you have as a Canadian and not having heard the word before, because for me, it was just what you grew up with. You know, you talked about, and it seems an obvious word to use. You go for a walk in the bush, so it's called bushwalking. But it, you know, it's pretty prosaic in a lot of ways. It doesn't kind of have quite that same, I guess, evocative air that some of those other terms have, rambling or tramping or even hiking. They have different kinds of connotations. So, you know, in a sense, it's a bit, you could say bushwalking, maybe it's a bit dull as a word, but I think
love it. I think it's great.
Yeah, no, I do too. I think it's got that prosaic kind of nature. And but yes, as an Australian word, I think, yeah, we can be proud to claim it as our invention and to describe the kind of walking that took place here. And it has a really rich history, and it's one that walkers had to kind of really fight for in a way. So, I mean, the term dates to the 1920s, and particularly when the Sydney Bushwalkers developed or formed in 1927. And so that wasn't the first time that the two words had come together to sort of say, well, you know, bushwalk. They'd been put together in a sentence before that, but it just took time for them to kind of come together and flow off the tongue, you know, to say, oh, let's go for a bushwalk, or let's go bushwalking this weekend. And it was really a lot to do with that Sydney Bushwalking Club, and they were a big club, and they were a very, had a strong sense of themselves as developing this new sort of activity. So they really promoted the word and claimed it and promoted, you know, the activity. So I just want to read this quote from the club, because they developed a quite distinctive definition of what bushwalking was. And this was in the 1930s. So they said, a walker, man or woman, who seeks social recreation and education in roadless wilderness or primitive areas or rugged country, and carries his or her own personal gear, food rations, and share of camp gear, who uses a tent, you know, and who practices bushcraft. So you can see there that they've got a very specific idea of what it is. And, you know, they're saying, I mean, you particular kinds of country, you carry your gear, you camp out. So they developed that quite specific idea. And in terms of your question about how it's different from hiking, I mean, in many ways, people would say, well, that's what hiking is, right? It is that kind of walk where you get away from known locations, you take your pack, you take your gear, you camp out. But in Australia, at least in the 1930s, we're using that term a lot more now too. But in Australia in the 30s, hiking was regarded as easy walking, and hikers were unskilled. Bushwalkers were professionals, hikers were the amateurs.
Yeah. I also thought it was really interesting in your book how, I mean, the 1920s, you know, that's about halfway through the book. You know, you really describe and characterize forms of walking that predate that. And so, you know, a history of bushwalking practice that goes way back and much earlier than that. And I think it would be really interesting to hear you talk a bit about how you perceive that history, like what you want people to take away from your book in terms of our understanding of bushwalking, that it perhaps comes much earlier than we might initially think.
Yeah, and when I first started writing the book, I thought I would really start from that period. But then, yeah, as I kept looking back, finding all sorts of interesting stories. I guess one of the first things I need to say is that, I mean, this is a history that looks at European or Western ideas of walking. So obviously walking was absolutely central to Indigenous culture in Australia for all kinds of reasons, for trade, for, ceremony, for connecting with country. But that idea of walking for recreation and pleasure is something different. And so that's the focus of the book. It is with that sort of European settler colonial tradition of walking. And I think one of the things that sort of happens with activities like bushwalking is people often assume they're so much a part of our culture. We take them for granted that they don't have a history. Or a particularly interesting one. So, but as you say, I mean, there is this really long history of recreational walking in Australia. So from the very beginnings of Europeans coming here, walking for pleasure. Of course, they had to do lots of walking, again, for all sorts of other reasons. We didn't have a lot of transport, but people were walking for pleasure from the very beginning. So, I start the book talking about surgeon George Morgan in 1788 talking about rambling, and he uses the term rambling for pleasure. So there's all sorts of ways in which people were walking, often short strolls that they were doing, turns about the garden, or walking to collect wildflowers, those sorts of things. But so it took time for what you could say initially might have been quite British ways of walking, for its sort of more distinctive, Australian characteristics to develop. So I think that's sort of one thing to take away. And I think the other thing I mentioned before is, that it took time and that it was sort of something that had to be fought for in a way. I mean, women had to kind of fight to be recognised as serious bushwalkers, even though there were plenty of women walking. And I think one of the other really important things to take away, it's probably something we'll pick up on later, is just how important bushwalking's been for settler Australians developing a sense of connection. You talked about, identity. So developing a sense of place here, developing a sense of connection with the land, and a need to sort of care for it as well, because bushwalkers have been really instrumental in environmental campaigns and movements.
There's an amazing cast of characters in the book. Amazing cast of characters. And as an art historian, I loved all the images. And I just want to hold up, I'm not sure if everyone can see, but Guide Alice, you absolutely have to say something about Guide Alice and her amazing pantsuit and, how she figures into your history, because this isn't, anyway, it's just it's fascinating history. So what can you tell us about Guide Alice and her forays into the bush and why she matters to your history of bushwalking?
Yeah, she was great. And as you say, one of the kind of many characters. And I think I fell in love with lots of the people that I wrote about in lots of ways, because they were so, lots of them are kind of unusual and a little bit eccentric sometimes. So Guide Alice was the daughter of landowners in the Mount Buffalo area in the 1890s. And, they were farming people, but they were looking at that time for other ways to make money. So again, this idea that we have now of sort of nature tourism or ecotourism, being a kind of recent phenomenon, there's lots of examples if we look back where that sort of thing's starting to develop much earlier. And so Guide Alice made that pantsuit herself, and she developed a real reputation from the late 19th century and into the early 20th century for taking tourists on walks in the Mount Buffalo area. One of the early visitors to Mount Buffalo in terms of tourism was John Monash, who went on to become one of Australia's great war leaders in World War One. So he was a really avid walker in, before and after the war. I don't know if Guide Alice herself led him, but certainly her father took and organised walks for John Monash and his friends, because he kind of made it a real, regular activity. So yeah, she's one of the particularly wonderful people.
And just the whole shift to being able to wear shorts as a, I mean, I do think that matters, and that's interesting. I don't know, you and I were recently talking about picnic at Hanging Rock. I know it's not bushwalking, but I was just thinking of the women who go up that hill wearing those long petticoats, so that shift and trend is really important to your history as well.
Yeah. Well, and in those there are some lovely photos, and not all of them made it into the second edition, but there's some lovely photos again from sort of early 1900s when women are going walking, and they look like those women in Picnic at Hanging Rock. I mean, they really had to battle with that kind of clothing, and men too. I mean, walking in the late 19th century, still hasn't kind of taken on that sort of Australian character with shorts, but so it was quite an upper middle class activity. Lots of businessmen, lawyers, politicians were in the sort of early bushwalking clubs, and they often went in very formal dress. So yeah, they went in, in suits and ties, and they were walking. Again, this is why some people would look back at that and say, oh, that's not really bushwalking, because they tended to be walking on country roads, wide pathways, and gentle sorts of strolls. But, increasingly they were getting off track and starting to shed some of that clothing.
Well, it's also interesting to think about the kinds of early bushwalkers. And I was also taken with the stories you told in the book about Percy Granger as a bushwalker. He'd go for a really fast walk before he'd perform. There was another, John Legade Brereton, who was a Shakespeare scholar and librarian, and he was really early on advocating for nature as nourishment for the mind. And I guess that kind of stems to that whole romantic tradition, and maybe thinking about why has walking for such a long time been associated with like intellectual clarity or inspiration. And I do think that's part of that early history of walking prior to like it's just exercise.
Well, I think, like today, I guess it's that being able to slow down, and so that frees the mind. And so certainly there was that sense, that, again, that period of time, late 19th century, growing appreciation of being outdoors, like you say, the romantic kind of movement, and getting out and enjoying nature, and then being able to slow down, and walking and thinking. They have gone together for such a long time. We could go back centuries to think about the ways in which walking and thinking go together, and walking and thinking in nature really did, I guess, carry that idea that it just freed you up. It made you more relaxed, more in touch, with your environment, with yourself. And again, I think that we really kind of think about it that way. John Legade Brereton, as you say, he, again, one of these kind of slightly eccentric walkers that I look at. He liked to go sort of quite often by himself, not something we necessarily recommend now when you go bushwalking. But he was somebody who sort of really, so he's walking, again, early 20th century. And, he was somebody who really liked to experience nature in a very sensuous, intimate way. He liked to go naked sometimes.
Yeah. Well, that brings me to the next thing I wanted to talk to you about, which was, Melissa, I think a subtitle for your book could have been Mystery Walks and Naked Bushwalking. You would have had, heaps of sales. But I think we need to talk about this, because I had never heard of mystery walks or naked bushwalking before reading your book. So you have to tell us about this phenomenon.
Yeah, well, mystery hikes were really... mystery hikes were really... like you say, interesting phenomenon. So they happened in 1932, which was really the height of a kind of interwar craze or enthusiasm for bushwalking. So it really that's when it really kind of its heyday. It really took off. And the mystery hikes happened at a very specific time, 1932. So, height of the Depression in Australia, and they just happened across the winter months. They happened elsewhere in the world as well. It wasn't just an Australian phenomenon, but basically they were organised by the railways. You bought your ticket, turned up at the train station, you know, usually Central Station in whatever city it was on, and then you'd be taken to another train station. You didn't know where you're going, so that was the mystery. So, and then, you know, you were deposited there, and you'd do a walk of a, you know, maybe, I mean, quite extensive, often 10 to 16 kilometre walk. And you'd have a picnic lunch in the middle of the day. There might be some entertainment. There might be a band there. There might have been a radio personality of the time who would sort of lead the walk sometimes. There would be people there selling chocolates and lollies, people dressed up sometimes to go on these walks. And then the train would take you back to the city. So as I said, they were enormously popular. In Brisbane, I think there were about 4 of them over that those winter months, and they sort of attracted in the sort of hundreds. But in Sydney, they were much bigger, and the largest one attracted over 8,000 people. So you can kind of just imagine, I mean, and the media attention was huge. There's fantastic images in the tabloid media of these hikes of people streaming down these wide bush roads. There was a wedding at one of them, which was hugely controversial. And I mean, the hikes themselves were pretty controversial. So bushwalkers were horrified. Like serious bushwalkers were absolutely horrified at the numbers of people who went on these walks. You know, they wore inappropriate clothing, because lots of the women, they went, you know, they wore heels, and then they get blisters, so they have to get ambulances to come along and fix up their blistered feet. They left their litter lying around. The churches were outraged because these were happening on a Sunday. And in 1930s Australia, Sunday was supposed to be a day for church going, or if you didn't go to church, you know, it was still supposed to be a day of rest, and there was very little open on a Sunday. So the fact that the railways were using these to make money was outrageous. So hugely controversial, lots of complaints. Again, lots of letter writing into the papers, editorials. Like, it's really quite extraordinary, the attention that these things got. So there was attempts to get them going again in 1933, but they weren't successful. But they really left their mark in terms of increasing the popularity of walking. And I think the other thing they did was harden the sense for bushwalkers that they were doing something different, and that they could really then cast hikers as the amateurs. And that's part of where that whole debate went on in Australia about, well, we can say they're hikers, they're not like us. And hiking carried all the connotations in Australia of being an Americanism. Yeah. And for middle class people, that was anathema. American entertainment was cheap, it was crass, it was commercial. Yeah. So bushwalkers were able to kind of use hiking and that as a way to separate themselves and to say, we're serious, we know what we're doing, you know, we use bushcraft, we know how to read maps, etc. So it really heightened the bushwalkers' sense of identity and gave them a sense that they were serious and new and you know, something important. Yeah. In terms of naked walking, that's a thing, yeah. Naked bushwalking, it's kind of hard to imagine. It's not hugely popular, but there is a tradition of it. So John Le Gay Brereton, as we've said, you know, he liked to stroll around naked and is looking for this sensuous, intimate experience. And he's got some lovely writing where he talks about that intimacy with nature. But I've had a few people recount stories to me of coming across naked bushwalkers, like now, today, or, you know, relatively recently. My husband and his mum once encountered a man walking the overland track in Tasmania in just his boots and his pack, which, you know, I mean, it's pretty cold. So they were walking along and he emerged out of the mist, and that was pretty confronting. But I've had other people, talk about naked bushwalkers, and there is a naked, there used to be a site, Bare Bushwalking Australia. There's someone now who, the naked canyoner. So, you know, that promotes that.
That's quite unique to Australia. If you did that in Canada, you would die. Like, you would just it would be freezing cold. But anyway, I think it's super interesting. Yeah. You know, back then when you were talking about the mystery walks and the identity that's kind of coming out of bushwalking as a phenomenon, I mean, another section of your book details sort of the emergence of bushwalking clubs, and I think that's a really important part of the story too. You know, how these clubs were established and their continuity and how much they matter today. So is that something, yeah.
Yeah.
There.
Well, again, there were clubs, you know, as I think I mentioned before, there were, well, people starting to walk, you know, really a lot more in the 1890s, and that's when you get the first clubs that are forming, and they tended to be only men, and some of them, like, quite actively resisted having women join. So some of the first ones, like there was the Melbourne Amateur Walking and Touring Club that formed in the early 1890s. And what was sort of interesting about that one was that, you know, it combined walking for sport, so that's the amateur walking, and walking for recreation, so that was the kind of touring. So there's another word, touring was often a way to describe walking. And so, yeah, the touring walking kind of was actually the side thing. It was the amateur race walking that they were into, but it gradually took over. And so then they just became the Melbourne Walking Club. There was the Warragamba Walking Club, which has two of my favourites in it. So William Mogford Hamlet. I mean, what a great name's that. So William Mogford Hamlet.
Yeah.
And Henry Tompkins. So, you know, they were both English and had a long history themselves of walking in England, and sort of then took up that kind of walking here, but again started to go off track. But the first sort of club that really gets a name for going and doing really difficult walks and extended walks and sleeping out in the bush, because most of those earlier clubs, if they slept out overnight, they stayed in accommodation. But the Mountain Trails Club, which formed in Sydney in 1914, you know, so, you know, war is happening. And excuse me, Miles Dunphy, who was one of the founders of that club, goes on to become, he's often called the father of bushwalking conservation in Australia.
Right.
So yeah, that Mountain Trails Club was, you know, hugely significant. But again, male only. He was adamant women cannot join this club. And it stayed throughout its entire lifetime. I think it's lasted for about 50 years. It stayed a male only club, and only about 50 odd members. Like, it was very exclusive. It was difficult to get in. So that was one of the things that became really important about bushwalking clubs, was having rules about who could join and having to do test walks. So Dunphy was important in the development of the Sydney Bushwalkers that I've referred to before, when they formed. And it was supposed to be a freer and easier club, and therefore it could have women. But it also became a club which developed, you know, a very strong sense of itself and a lot of like entry rules, like, so test walks.
Yeah.
So that became a really strong theme in clubs. But you had them developing, so in the 20s, in Sydney, in Melbourne. Brisbane's a bit later. Bushwalking clubs sort of don't really happen so much in Brisbane till the 40s. You know, I think, as Chrissy said before, it's hot. So that's sort of one of the things which made it a bit slower. Tasmania, of course, they're also happening in the 1920s.
Yeah.
The Hobart Walking Club, you know, it becomes a huge club. So yeah, clubs become really important in promoting bushwalking and promoting it as a serious recreation and something that should be taken seriously. But also, you know, they were often, as I said, a bit eccentric. When you mentioned shorts before, and so it's, you know, yes, they're starting to kind of develop clothing that is more appropriate and develop equipment that's more appropriate. So clubs were really important in sharing information with one another about, well, where are we going to go? What do we need to take? Because, you know, got to remember that, yeah, people were often using backpacks or rucksacks that they would make, or sometimes they might be importing them from Europe. They weren't necessarily suitable for here, or they were using military packs and it's kind of having to modify them. They weren't, you know, good boots like we have now, the kind of clothing. They were heavy boots.
And you mentioned also in the book the link with swag, and the swag, you know, how that was kind of a model for some early bushwalkers.
Yeah. So they sort of tap into those sort of traditions, you know, in Australia, yeah, of the swagman. I mean, in some ways, he was a bit of a model for bushwalkers. And so Miles Dunphy actually was somebody who never took to the rucksack. He used a swag and had his very, you know, particular, he had a pattern. I mean, his records are in the State Library in New South Wales. There's boxes and boxes. I can't remember now, I think it's 70 odd boxes material. Beautiful drawings, because he was an architect, of his, designs for packs and that sort of thing. Food lists, huge, like, again, bushwalkers, about, it was so important to get the weight of your pack, something that was manageable, because if you're having to take your tent, your food for 5-7 day walks, there wasn't food like we have now. It wasn't lightweight stuff. People were
like energy bars and
what was that?
Energy bars or like trail mix things.
Yeah, well, scroggin, yes.
Yeah.
So taking your fruit and nut mix, but yeah, no energy bars. So yeah, getting your weight down, like make every ounce count, was the motto of the sort of serious bushwalker.
I should throw in here so everyone knows this. I mean, this book is meticulously researched. It's just, the amount of, it is Melissa, and the sources you draw upon and the images you pulled in there. I mean, this is, I can just see the quality of the research in this book. And I think that, it's also interesting to see you engage with the contemporary scene for bushwalking as well. And that was one of the things I found striking, because, this is a new edition of this book, and to see you engage at the end in particular with new developments and reflecting upon, the contemporary scene for bushwalking. And I'm sure that would interest everyone to hear more about, because I'm sure there's some bushwalkers in this group here. And maybe just to hear you talk about how you perceive differences from, say, the 30s, 40s, when bushwalking is coming to its own, versus now, when I think people aren't necessarily parts of clubs, or, they're just, and so, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, well, as you say, clubs, I guess in the 50s, clubs kind of started to worry that people weren't joining, and that's sort of been a on and off phenomenon since that time. Bushwalking, I suppose, developed a bit of a reputation, or the serious hardcore bushwalker, they developed a bit of a reputation for being a bit daggy, which I think is a bit unfortunate, but sort of that was it. And the club walker, I think, club walkers in particular, sort of, and some of the research that's come out of Victoria recently, so bushwalking clubs and federations that bring clubs together have sought to kind of counter the lack of people wanting to join. It seems to be clubs tend to attract, not only, but tend to attract people, my age and up, so 50s and up, people in their 50s and 60s. So clubs have got that concern about, we're not getting this influx of younger people in them, so they worry about that. Holding steady amongst those older people. So I think, clubs are still important. And they played a hugely important role in advocating for bushwalkers, for track making, for example. And clubs have often been track makers. And so then they've also become quite protective of particular areas. So, but yeah, they haven't necessarily been able to convince younger people of the benefits of joining a club. There are benefits, experience, insurance cover, for example, because we've become a very risk-averse culture. So there's always a lot of concern about people going out and getting lost, and other people having to rescue them. So clubs are still important, but as you say, less so. But bushwalking is showing no signs of losing its popularity. If anything, I think it's growing in popularity, and that was one of the things that really interested me when I did the update, and looking at that kind of growth. And younger people are using social media platforms to meet up with other people who want to go walking. So meetup groups. And there are some really big meetup groups in Brisbane. It's actually some of the biggest ones in Australia in terms of bushwalking and enabling you to connect with other people. And I guess younger people find those in a way more acceptable, or they like them more than a club, because, clubs have meetings, and, a lot of politics goes on in clubs. Which you can kind of avoid to a certain extent when you're just kind of getting onto a social media platform and saying, oh, okay, so, there's a bunch of people going to go for a walk this weekend, I'm going to join them. So there's sort of not necessarily so much politics. There's no joining fees. You know, bushwalking clubs have joining fees, so they can provide things like insurance.
Yeah.
So I think that's really interesting that younger people are taking to social media platforms to find out places to go walking.
Yeah.
So it's still really popular as a regular kind of recreation activity. I mean, you know, I just went to the Bunya Mountains for a few days, and there's plenty of people there walking, and families, you know, older people, younger people. So there's, you know, all kinds of people walking. I mean, I should say one of the clubs have never been, or bushwalking. Some of our migrant population have found our style of walking a bit intimidating. They find the bush intimidating. So it hasn't necessarily, it's still quite a Anglo activity.
Right.
There has been some attempts though to use bushwalking as a way to help refugees connect to Australia. So that's kind of been a really interesting phenomenon as well. I think something else that's made it accessible is that we've now got a standard grading system across Australia for walks. So it's one of the ways in which it's sort of become standardised in a way, I suppose, tracks, so that it's really easy to find a track that's suitable for you, you know, and that across Australia, you know, you can sort of know what that track involves, you know, your level of fitness and ability. And of course, having, you know, the internet and huge amount of information that's so readily accessible now about tracks. So government, you know, the national parks websites across Australia provide so much information about walks.
So those are all the amazing positive developments.
Yeah.
Really also taken by your critical voice in those last chapters when, you know, you talk about some of the luxury models being proposed for hikes as problematic.
Yeah.
And I think that is a really interesting and important point for you to raise, to talk about here.
Yeah, so I guess one of the things that's really happened is, and this is again relatively recent, like the last decade, that there's been an enormous amount of attention from, again, government and private enterprise to develop long distance walking. So I'm not talking here about really long distance tracks that have been another feature I haven't really spoken about here, like things like the Human Hobble or the Bibbulmun track, the Bibbulmun's in WA, or the Larapinta, those kind of tracks that might be 100 or, you know, even more extensive than that 100 Ks. I'm talking about the tracks that are sort of 3 or 4 night walks that provide facilities and accommodation. So Tasmania's Three Capes track is the standout one here. So it's a 4-day, 3-night walk. It was supposed to be a 5-night walk, but they ran out of money. And so it's now 3-night. It's on the Tasman Peninsula. It's sort of, in a way, what it does, one of the things that we've had such an adherence to camping out that if you're going to go on an extended walk, you camp. Whereas in New Zealand and Canada, you know, where the weather conditions are more hostile, huts have been so much more of a feature of extended walks. So New Zealand's got that huge tradition of huts. We haven't had. So the Three Capes track's been hugely important because it provides these very comfortable cabins, memory foam mattresses, yoga mats, phone chargers, cooking facilities, etc. So you can carry a relatively small pack if you're doing the Three Capes track through the national parks. But what's also happened is that you've had, and there's a model for it with the Overland, you know, it introduced luxury guided walks alongside the one you could do yourself. So where you have, you know, you can just carry a tiny day pack. You get beautifully cooked meals at night, red wine, you know, lovely breakfast in the morning. And they cost, you know, they come at a cost. I mean, they cost often for a 3-4 day walk, you're paying $3,000, $4,000, as opposed to, I mean, when I did the Overland track back in 1999 and you're just doing it camping out, I think I paid $50. I mean, it's a little bit more expensive now for the independent walk because they've introduced more of a permit system. But so that model of the Three Capes, because it's been so successful for Tasmania, for tourism, has now become the kind of gold standard of what the government in Tassie wants to do elsewhere, and what other governments in Australia are doing, and private walking companies then want to have alongside these tracks their luxury models. So Kangaroo Island Wilderness Trail, for example, the Australian Walking Company, so that's one of the main companies. They began in Tassie with the Tasmania Walking Company, setting up these luxury walks alongside. The Kangaroo Island Wilderness Trail, the Australian Walking Company has a plan in place to develop, a luxury high-end version of that. They were taken to court, by locals, environmentalists who worried about the environmental damage of, more huts, so that more of a footprint, and those huts were going to be built closer to the coastline, so in fragile environments, etc. So at the moment, some of these tracks they haven't been built. That one, of course, Kangaroo Island Wilderness Trail, suffered in the bushfires, so it's now open, and that high-end walk sort of in limbo as they are in other parts of Australia. But so I am critical of, look, it's complicated. They provide an opportunity for people to who might not be able to walk in those kinds of environments, the opportunity to do so.
Yeah.
But I worry about the rate and pace of the way these things have been developing and how they're sort of taken up as a model, and the way that the people behind, I find that the people behind the Australian Walking Company, it's quite an elitist view that they're often putting forward, that they're bringing people to these walks that, naturally will look up, will want to then go on and become environmentalists. And I don't know that that is the case.
Yeah.
I worry that it becomes another sort of, I've done that one, now I'm going to go do the next one. It doesn't necessarily translate that they're going to then become advocates for the environment. And what I worry about happening is they're going to be going into more and more remote parts of Australia, where you're getting flown in, and that's starting to happen in Tassie. Again, there's another walk down there, hugely controversial. So they become very inaccessible to only, the wealthiest of people. So how much is that actually going to help save the environment? And they have environmental impacts themselves. Yeah. So yes,
you talk about that a little bit, like the environmental impacts of those, if you put down, well, what I'd say in Canadian, it's like boardwalks and, extent, that kind of approach, or the raised platforms for tents, things like that. It's like some of them seem okay, but then if it's too extensive, it can become really problematic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's a thing. And even the government ones as well, that's what they're doing. And they can also provide environmental protection.
Yeah. By
having boardwalks, because you're keeping people off fragile soils.
Yeah.
And same with tent platforms. You limit, you're containing where people can go. So they have a purpose, but I just worry about the spread of them.
Yeah.
And that this becomes, and I guess the other thing that, it's tricky because all kinds of debates come up around, where do you draw the line? Yeah. And about who can go and who can determine who can go.
Yeah, exactly.
So yes, they have a purpose, but I think we need to be careful about limiting them. And also I think the other thing that happens is because so much money is being invested in these high-end or tourist walks, we're often forgetting about the everyday tracks. And that might just be far more accessible, like on a weekend to go to for, everyday kind of walk.
Day trip, yeah.
And so the maintenance of those isn't kept up because, national parks have got limited resources. So their resources, because they're under all this pressure to perform economically. We've got this kind of utilitarian idea about nature that we have to use it. It has to be, sort of used, and we have to go to places, and we'll only save places if we get to go to them. I think we need to be able to step away from that and to think, well, why do we have to go to places? Can some places just be left? But also, yeah, we shouldn't be just channeling all the resources into those. We should also be maintaining the upkeep of those tracks that are just, you know, in our far more accessible areas in suburbs and areas of the cities. But, you know, we are seeing degradation of those tracks and lack of maintenance and upkeep.
I think we're almost coming to a point where we should open up to questions, but I'm just going to ask one last one, which is, Melissa, I know you got asked this all the time with the first edition. Are you a bushwalker? And do you have a favorite trail? I mean, it had to be asked.
Sure. And I did get asked that all the time. And I think part of the reason I got asked that when I was writing this was because people thought, well, you would only write this book if you were a serious bushwalker. Why would you do it otherwise?
But academics, it's
and I mean, look, the thing that really attracted me to this story of bushwalking was the fact that when I realised, well, here is this activity that is so Australian, it's so popular, and it hasn't really been told as a history. And there are all these fabulous stories, quirky people. I mean, I think there is a vein of eccentricity running through a lot of the characters.
Yes.
So there's a real sort of, so I love that. That really attracted me to it. I am a walker. I like walking. I grew up in the suburbs of Sydney where we actually had bush that kind of just was an extension of the backyard. So I spent a lot of time, you know, just sort of playing in the bush as a kid. I certainly do, go bushwalking. I think in terms of favourites, I mean, there's lots. You know, I think growing up in Sydney, I became very familiar with that sort of bush of the sandstone country and that kind of eucalypt environment. So the Blue Mountains, I miss a lot. I absolutely love. And the Grand Canyon walk, it's called, in Blackheath. It's only a 6K walk, but there's plenty of steps up out of it. I adore that walk. I love that walk. But since moving to Brisbane, I mean, Binnaburra, you can't help but just, you know, fall in love with. And that was one of the things, to reflect on in the book at the start.
The fire,
the damage that happened to Binnaburra. But I'm delighted that they've reopened just recently, just last month. Lots of the tracks have been reopening. But also Tassie. I mean, you know, I travelled to Tasmania to do research for the book. I met my husband in Tasmania, so I talk about, I was going to read, but I don't think we'll have time for that. But, you know, I write about doing the overland track with my husband and my sister back in 1999. And so that track, you know, I haven't been back and done the full walk, only been back to the area, but that's also a pretty special one.
That's a great passage in the book when you're sort of cursing your travel companions initially, and then you settle into, I mean, it was very evocative. And like I said, everybody, this book is a treat. You should read it. It's just great. So thanks for chatting, Melissa, and we'll hand over to Chrissy, I guess.
Thanks, Andrea.
Yeah.
Thank you. This has been absolutely fascinating. And you have answered a couple of the questions that have been asked already, but Claude has asked one that has been answered, and she, at the end of it, she asks about walking alone in the bush in Australia. Are there any kind of issues to do with people being alone walking?
Yes, I mean, as I said, it's really not recommended because, you know, you can just get in, if you get into trouble, you're out there, and, you know, we've seen too many tragic examples of people losing their life, you know, and sometimes that's, because they've, I mean, sometimes it's inexperience, sometimes it's just, you might fall over and then, you know, you're into yourself and someone doesn't know where you are. Weather conditions can change dramatically. So there's been some really tragic incidents on the overland track, and sometimes with tourists, of, you know, tourists, the mists come in, the fogs come in, and you just don't know where you're going. You lose your bearings. So that's one of the, you know, the concerns that people have. So it's always that idea that, you know, you should let someone know where you're going when you go for a walk. Even, I think, I mean, I've got a couple of friends that when they go for a walk, they always text me and say, we're going on this walk today. We'll text you when we're back. just so that someone else knows that they've gone. So yeah, people do it. But yeah, it's not hugely recommended. And there's a lot of, you know, I mean, same with sailing, right? Where people get lost at sea. There often can be a lot of anger when people go and get lost in the bush, particularly if they've gone unprepared. So there's been a bit of a push, you know, over the last decade or so for people to carry emergency beacons so that they can alert emergency services if they, you know, do get lost. Also a lot of tension around the use of those things too, because again, serious bushwalkers say, well, you shouldn't go if you're not able to read a map, find your way, etc. So there's all sorts of interesting debates and contests that go on, and that's one of them, walking alone, whether you should or not.
Yeah, fair enough. You do hear some horror stories on the news, that's for sure.
Yep.
So Emma has asked a question. She's asked two questions. One is, what is the most interesting fact that you came across in your research? And the other one is about the traditional owners of the land that you're walking on, and whether you got any insight into you know, respect for the bush and connecting with the traditional owners.
I'll start with that one. I'll have to think about the most interesting. So yeah, in terms of, I mean, I think that's one of the really sort of interesting, it's a thread in the book that I look at in terms of Indigenous ownership and traditional owners, because look, certainly most Europeans, when they're first walking, and even, you know, up until the 1960s, there's very little awareness of traditional owners when people are walking, or if there was, it was more in the sense that you know, they had disappeared. So yeah, it's one of the sort of, I suppose, sides of bushwalking that's problematic. So bushwalkers, I mean, they kind of might give some recognition to Indigenous places. Miles Dunphy, for example, did use some Indigenous names in his mapping and naming practice with the bush and walks, but for the most part, yeah, they saw them as having disappeared. Now, so what's been, you know, good much more recently is the way in which there's far more recognition of that. National parks, of course, now give, you know, recognition of Indigenous ownership. We're starting to see employment of Indigenous rangers by some national parks. Of course, there's been some handover of parks to the traditional owners, and then, you know, having to work then. So, you know, us as Europeans needing to work with and take on the voices and advice and guidance and knowledge of Indigenous people. And there's been a couple of really interesting examples now too of traditional owners developing tracks. So there's the Bundian Way in New South Wales, which is sort of still under development, but that's, yeah, the traditional owners are, you know, leading the way with that walk, and they hope that one day it will be one of these kind of extended walks, you know, with good accommodation, etc. And there's also a commercial operation which is owned by the traditional owners in Tasmania, the Wukalina Walk. I think it's a 3-day walk. And so it's, you know, it's an opportunity for non-Indigenous Australians to get some education and some knowledge, and to, and so I think, you know, I'd like to think that bushwalking, despite that history of ignorance and, you know, that was shared by Australia more broadly, with bushwalking, you know, I'd like to think that perhaps bushwalking now can be a way of connection, but we have to be respectful. There are lots of places in Australia, you know, like, you know, we've seen now the closure of the Climate Uluru, but there are plenty of other walks and, you know, mountains that Indigenous people would rather we didn't climb. Mount Biwa, Mount Coolum, you know. Absolutely. So I think we need to be listening.
That sounds fantastic. I'll check out those Aboriginal run tracks. Actually, the Tasmanian one sounds very interesting.
Yes.
Yeah. So Sally Piper has asked, how much do you think bushwalking, particularly in the remote wild places, has become more about conquering than discovering?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Sally. That kind of idea of conquering and discovering was really important to sort of that bushwalking movement that I spoke about. And one of the kind of, again, interesting tensions in the bushwalking movement was about that. It's like people saying, well, so somebody, it's all about adventure and we've got to get out there and we've got to conquer the land, and sort of have that adventure. So there was that sort of mold, and others going, hang on a sec, let's just slow down. Let's just really enjoy where we are and take, account of the place, and kind of go back to, I guess, some of those traditions of walking more slowly and walking and thinking and connecting. So I think those threads are both still there. I think that, that idea of conquering is certainly still with us. And I think in some ways social media kind of has accentuated that, because that visibility that some places now have through social media then encourages other people, I've got to get to that place too. And so there are, some of the nature photographers, for example, have stopped kind of going to certain places because their beautiful images encouraged other people to go and want to go, and got to get there and got to get my picture taken there and, my selfie. And it's led to a lot of environmental damage. So it's definitely a strong thread.
Yeah, fair enough. So Ruben has asked, how freely are people able to plan their own trek in Australia? And what would be some things you would recommend to keep in mind for people who are looking to plan their own walks and treks, legalities, practicalities, etc.?
I guess it depends on the kind of walks. It sounds like Ruben's talking about something quite long in terms of trekking and legalities and practicalities. I mean, I think the thing is, as I said, there's lots of information. So it's thinking about the kind of walk that you want to go on, like what kind of environment, would he most like to walk in? I mean, is he after sort of, dense, heavily wooded wilderness style walking, or something more open that you might find in the Northern Territory? So I think, one thing is to decide what kind of environment you want. How fit are you? So really thinking about, well, what level of fitness that you have and that you can bring to it. And so then sort of how long you want to go for, because you can go for walks, some walks in Tassie, for example, people will go for 14 days, even longer, and you have to then organise food drops. So, the logistics are often quite significant. So I think, you kind of need to decide what style of walk, how fit you are, how long you're going to go for, and then you can sort of start planning around that. And I think, going into camping equipment shops, because most of the people that work in those shops, like the Paddy Pal and the Mountain Designs, they're really experienced walkers. So you can get great advice from them. Or again, clubs, all the states as well have federations. So even if you don't want to join a club, you can often get advice and guidance by contacting someone in the federation of the bushwalking movement sort of thing. So, I think he asked about legalities as well, but there's nothing to stop you going by yourself.
Yeah. Well, I think Ruben has sort of mentioned that it's he's looking at going from the source of a river to the sea, which sounds like it could be quite a long,
amazing
journey, an amazing journey. I think I've read a couple of books about that actually, not in Australia, but very interesting. And back to Claude, who's asked a few questions tonight, but they've been answered through the conversation. But Claude has done 10 years ago at 64. She crossed 2 countries alone in Europe, and wants to know whether walking alone in Europe and Australia, they're kind of different beasts in a way, aren't they? What are the different, what's the difference, and why would you not recommend walking alone in Australia as opposed to Europe?
I think, I don't know the walks that Claude did in Europe, but often in Europe, the walks tend to be where you are, the track is very well established, and you're often walking from town to town, and there's accommodation. And so your access to you know, you have a phone, I guess, or there might be more people also walking the track. So if you do get injured or run into some kind of difficulty, it's not going to be so problematic. Someone to help you. Whereas in Australia, often, you know, you might go on one of these long walks and there's no one else. And you're in dense bushland, and, you know, I mean, again, it depends on the walk. I mean, I sometimes go for some walks with just me and my dog in bushland in the gap where I live. But yeah, they're probably ones where other people are going to come by that day. So if I was to, and I probably take my phone with me most of the time. So I think it's that accessibility to assistance if something does go wrong. And there's so many parts of Australia that if you're out there on your own, yeah. And we just had the tragic case in Victoria of the 14-year-old boy who went out for his run and spent the night in the bush and didn't survive.
Yeah, ticks and snakes, that's all I think about.
That's true. I haven't even talked about them.
Look, it's been really fascinating. We have run out of time, unfortunately, but it's been really fascinating listening to you talk about your book. And this is a book that's accessible. It is a book that is not just for academics. It's a really well-researched book, which is there for everybody to enjoy, particularly people who do already enjoy the bush. And it's been such a fascinating afternoon talking with you both. So thank you very much, Andrea, for that conversation. And thank you very much, Melissa, for bringing this book to us. And to finish off our event tonight, I'm going to tick the allow participants to unmute themselves button so that we can have a final round of applause. So that's ticked now, and we can all clap. So let's have a round of applause for Melissa and Andrea. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and just to reiterate what Chrissy said, I didn't write this book as a an academic book. It's written for a general reader. It's written to be accessible, and I want people to read it rather than it might be based on a lot of research, but yes, I think it's accessible.
And there are copies available at Avid Reader. It is Love Your Bookshop Day, so do remember that today is a good day to pop in and show your love to a bookshop. Ours, hopefully, or the one closest to you if you're not here. And do remember that you can get that 10% off if you use the word event at the counter. So when you go online shopping, use the word event and you can get 10% off. So thank you, everybody, and we'll see you around the traps.
Thanks, Chrissy. Thanks, everyone, who came along.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.